Welcome to a live recording from socialmedia.org's Brands Only Summit, the How to Run Social Media at a Big Brand conference. This is Michael Wu from Lithium Technologies with his presentation, The Science of Social, from Social Metrics to ROI.
Right, thank you everyone. So when I was invited to give this talk, our marketing team have sent out a kind of little short blurb about the recent book that I just written on the social customers. But this is a metrics talk, right? So I'm actually going to talk to you more about like the social metrics to ROI. So it's a little bit different from what the book's been written, just to let you know that. Okay, so there are actually many social metrics out there. Okay, so social metrics are typically measure the operational level, right? That means they are typically things like clicks, fans, likes, +1s, follower, mentions, and things of that sort that you all know about, right? But when you talk about ROI, people want to know what happened at the business level, right? People wanted to know what the KPI is, such as conversion, ROI, customer satisfaction, or ultimately sales, right? All right, now, they're a completely different level, right? One is kind of at the operation level, one at the business level. How do you bridge that gap? Now, to bridge that gap, that's what I think a lot of social analytics tries to do, right? And often fail, but try, nevertheless, right? So social analytics tries to fill the gap by creating like derived metrics, right? People don't measure sentiments. Sentiment is a result of a computation, right? I talk about, I love this brand. And some computer have to crunch what that means and give me a score of +1 to -1, right? People don't have, share of voice, influence, all these are computed, derived from the raw data that you talk about in this morning, right? All right, so now how do you, actually go from here to here, right? So this is typically, social analytics typically describe a possible mechanism which these kind of operation metric can affect the business at the business level, right? But they're not always kind of understood, right? So the question is, how do you actually go from here to here? Well, to answer that question, let me tell you two classes of models, right? This morning we have to build models, right? Models are not the reality, but they are something like reality. So there are two types of models are correlation model, and the other one is mechanism model, right? So with correlation model, all you need is data and statistics, right? But the problem with that is that data and statistics will only give you correlation. And we all know that correlation is not causation, right? So how do you get causation? Maybe I want to give a try there. How do you prove causation? Yeah?
Control group.
Sorry?
Control group.
Control group? Yeah, that's very close, okay? So to get causation, what you need is experimental manipulation. But how do you know your media by like your TV ads are driving sales? Well, you know it because if you stop it, it doesn't happen, right? When you start it again, it drives sales again, right? When you manipulate it, that's when you can prove causation. With data only, you can't. Technically, in theory you can, but it's really, really hard. You cannot prove smoking caused cancer with data. That's how hard it is. You can prove it by biology, but not with data alone, all right? So now, when you experiment and manipulate enough, then eventually you get a very detailed understanding of how these kind of base metric, this operational metric gets translated to your business KPI. Then you have a detailed understanding of what's going on. Then you can actually build a mechanistic model. Okay, so I'm going to very quickly tell you as an exemplary example of a mechanism model that I built by telling us this story about like quantifying people's influence on social media. That's a hot topic that a lot of people want to know about, and many people try to do it. So you know who they are, all right? So now, despite the fact there's a lot of data that's been generated on social media, no one actually has data on who influenced who, right? Cloud doesn't have it. What they have is social media activity. Right? They don't have who influenced who. They don't ask a user who influenced your purchase. They don't have that. They infer that. They actually do some computation on that. right? So you can ask, well, what about these influence vendors, right? What they have is a black box model, right? What they have, this black box model, they input to this black box model social media activity metrics, right? And you do through some computation, right? Not measurement, they're different, okay? You get some influence score, right? This user may have 75 or so, right? And the problem is that anyone could come up with this model, right? I mean, I think people with any simple, statistics skill, math skill, you could come up with a model, right? And it's actually not validated, and so its accuracy is unknown, right? A lot of people say it doesn't work, right? And at best, is kind of, so when they give you a score of 75, right? How do you know the person is not 85? I'm sure a lot of you here have a cloud score. Is that accurate? How would they know that is not a different score, right? Maybe it's 85, maybe it's 35, right? Maybe it's 65. Who knows, right? Nobody can validate that. It's not validated, right? So so there's no feedback mechanism for updating the model, and at best is sparsely validated. What that means is that, okay, I know President Obama is really, really influential, so he comes up 95, so my model is correct. This is what we call over-extrapolation, what Jim talked about this morning, right? They over-extrapolated. Okay, so to actually quantify influence, we actually need a little bit more sophisticated mathematical tool. And I'm going to tell you about a little tool called social network analysis, short for SNA, right? So what is social network anyway? In order to do social network analysis, you got to know what social network is, right? Social network is, everybody know what they are, but what is it? Can you define what it is? It is really just a collection of entities plus the relationship between them. That's a social network, all right? And with social network, these entities are typically people, all right? And so in the SNA, social network analysis lingo, these are called nodes and vertices, right? And then and the relationship can be pretty much anything, right? Could be friendship, could be colleagues, or kinships, or anything you want. All right, and these relationships are called edges of connection in the SNA lingo. All right, so now you know what a social network is. What about a social graph? A social graph is simply a diagram consists of nodes and edges that represent that social network. Wow, that's very simple, right? But the key is that with one social network, you can actually generate many, many different social graphs. Okay, so for example, my social network consists of my friends, my colleagues, my relatives, right? All these people are part of my social network, right? But they may be on different social graph, right? My Facebook network is one graph, right? My LinkedIn network is a different graph, different social graph, right? Just illustrate this with a very simple example, right? I maybe have a really simple life. So I'm the Dilbert this morning, right? I'm a data scientist, right? So I have a very simple life. I only have 7 friends, right? My colleagues are these 2 guys here. So they are, since if we work at the same company, then they got to be working in the same company as well. So we all link together, right? And these 2 people worked with me in different before I joined Lithium. So they also are linked together. So so when I was at Berkeley, I also worked with these people. So as you know that these people are linked together. When I work with them, but these 2 are not because they actually are the bosses who are different. One is in UC Berkeley, one at Los Alamos, right? So now, okay, so this could very well be my LinkedIn social graph, right? On LinkedIn. Now, I also like to drink Belgian beer, so I have a lot of drinking buddies, right? So when I was at Lithium, everywhere I go, I drink with people, right? I drink Belgian beers. They're great, right? So these people are people who drink together, right? But somehow Ryan and Doug doesn't get along, so they actually, are not linked together, right? So it turns out that Phil and Jack also they know each other. They often go out and drink together, right? But they don't drink with us, so they don't have any edges connecting us, right? So that's my beer buddy graph. Okay. So now I noticed that I have just created 2 social graphs for my social network. My very simple social network that have only 7 friends, right? And what I do is I simply highlight the different relationship that I care about, right? If the relationship that I care about is drinking beer with someone, right? Then I get the beer buddy graph, right? If the relationship I care about is I work with someone, then this LinkedIn type of network is the one that I care about, right? So but I could create other networks as well, right? So Facebook basically claps all these things together and call these people friends, right? Friends have so many contacts. So basically just calling them friends, you lose all those contacts, basically, right? So this is Facebook's friendship social graph, right? So by specifying what relationship that you care about, or that the edges represent, you get a very different graph. Okay, that's why social graphs are different from social network, all right? Now, what is social network analysis then? So social network analysis is basically a construction of a social graph that represents the relationship that you care about, and then analysis of this graph by computing metrics on these nodes and edges, right? For example, I could compute something called the degree centrality. So degree centrality is how many people that you're connected to, right? So this person is connected to 5 person, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 right here. This guy only connects to 1 person, so that's it, right? Now, so that's just a metric, just a computational metric. The last step is that you have to interpret these metrics and get some insights, intelligence about how this social network works, right? So I can tell you that, in this very simple network, most people have about 3 connections, right? Without doing the computation of these metrics, you would not have known that. You would never get that, right? So after you compute the metric, you have to still analyze that metric with standard statistics, right? So reading a social graph, the most important thing is that you find out what the edge represent, what relationship is represented by the edge, and don't try to make any inference and conclusions about based on the analysis of the graph where the edge is not represented explicitly, right? People are trying to use friendship network to infer influence. They're not the same thing, right? Just because I'm your friend doesn't mean I'm influence you. I have the capacity to influence you, right? That's not the same thing as influence, right? So I'm going to talk about influence a little bit. So influence is not social media connection, right? This is what I just said, right? So, or for example, friends and followers, right? So what constitutes real influence? Well, basically by analyzing 10 years of data on our Lithium platform, I found that 6 factors are really, really important, right? One is what we call domain credibility. If I don't have the credibility, I can't influence anyone. Yeah, you'd be just pack your bag and go home. You won't listen to me here, right? So on the other hand, if you have the credibility, but you don't say anything, right, I can't influence you either. So the second factor is bandwidth, right? I have to communicate on social media or something else, right? So bandwidth just tells you that the influencer's ability to transmit his thoughts on the channels that you care about, right? The third factor is relevance. Okay, so if you are trying to buy a camera, and I have an expert in cars, right? He may tell you a lot about cars. He may say, "Great, wonderful, thank you," but he's not going to influence your purchase decision on the camera. Not relevant, right? Timing is another dimension of relevance. This is what we call temporal relevance, right? So basically, every consumer have only a small window of susceptibility, so that he's actually under his susceptibility influence. Now, so this last fifth factor, not the last one, fifth factor is alignment. They have to be on the same channel, right? Regardless of it's online or offline. If you're trying to find an influencer on Facebook, doesn't help you to find the influencer. Doesn't help you when you analyze the Twitter data, right? If you're trying to run a marketing campaign in LA, doesn't help you to find the influencer in New York. Finally, you have confidence. Okay, so how much a target trusts the influencer, right? That's confidence. This is what people call about trust, right? Now, domain credibility and confidence are not the same thing. Trust is not the same thing. This is an attribute of the influencer. This is an attribute of the audience, right? They're not the same. Okay, only the interesting thing about this model is that you have to have all 6 of these factors in order for the influencer's influence to propagate to the target. If you're missing any one factor, right? For example, if you're missing the right timing, right? Then, you may already buy something. You already bought what you needed, right? And you may not. You're too late, right? So, so finding the potential influencer. What kind of data do we use to find influencers? So there are lots of data, right? So one is what I call participation velocity. The other one is called social equity and social graph, right? So these what give us the high bandwidth user. These are people who talks a lot, the loud mouth, right? This is what a lot of the social media the influence vendors are focused on, because these are data that's very, very readily available. So they focus on those data, right? So very often you find that the social media influence vendors, they often just give you the loudmouth. Okay. Now, what about credibility? Yeah, credibilities are, you have several data sources that you could get this. And one, is self-declared. For example, on LinkedIn, if you work on a certain industry for 10 years or 20 years, you may probably have some credibility, right? Reputation data, if you want some recognition. Lastly, reciprocity, right? When other people say that you are good, you know what you're saying, you know what you're talking about. So this is actually very important in social, right? Reciprocity data. So the intersection of these two sets is what give you the potential influencers, right? Now these are only the potential influencers because I only consider two factors so far. I only consider, the bandwidth and credibility. Let's take a look at the importance of relevance and timing with the social graph data, right? So let's say this is a social graph, and each one of these dots right here represents a person, and each one of these kind of gray edges represents a friendship, right? So this guy is this guy's friend, right? This guy is this guy's friend, all right? So now, with no further information, who do you think the influencer is in this social graph? Say you are a brand manager at Apple. You're trying to find the influencer for the new Apple iPhone 5. Who would you select? Most of you will probably just say, hey, it's this guy, because he got so many friends, right? But we can track all the conversation that went on, right? And I can actually color the conversations that actually mention Apple iPhone 5 with the color red, right? Now, if I color them red, look what happened. Okay, this guy has a lot of friends, but he never talks about Apple iPhone 5 with him, right? So whatever that relationship is actually irrelevant, right? So this is what we call the irrelevant relationship. The relevant relationship are the people that you actually talk to about, you mentioned Apple iPhone 5, right? So now, who do you think the influencer is? Probably these two guys, right? Is Fangirl or WizKid, right? Now, we have more data, right? We have timestamps of every conversation that went on. Now, I could color these conversations with a lighter shade of red when they've happened further back in time. Now, if I do that, this is what I get. Now, look what happened. So Fangirl is actually a light pink here, if you could see this. Fangirl was an influencer, but she was an influencer probably 3-6 months ago. Now, WizKid is the influencer for you, right? So in a real social graph, you will actually have many of these, people like WizKid here, right? But it will be really dense. It's really hard for you to see. But you could compute something called like the degree centrality, or something simple as that, or eigenvector centrality to characterize who actually has the most relevant amount of influence with regard to the relationship that you care about, right? Okay, so finding the influencer is really just think of it as intelligent filtering, right? You could, if they are, the easiest way to filter out is people in the wrong channel, right? If they're not even in the right channel that you care about, they don't matter, right? So the next one is content. If they don't mention the stuff that you care about, then you could filter them out, right? And then timing, right? If they talk about it in the wrong time, the relevant time is now, typically, right? But how far do you go back? Do you go back 3 months, 6 months, a year, right? Depending on what product, right? If you're talking about like buying a house, right? Maybe you have to go back 6 months, a year. But if you're talking about a car, maybe a couple months. If you're talking about a phone, maybe it's weeks or days, right? People make decisions much shorter in those products, right? So you filter out those people, right? If they don't matter, right? And then finally, you look at bandwidth, and then finally you look at credibility, right? You can filter those people who don't have enough credibility, and then finally you're left with a few people that you actually consider potential influencers, right? Then this is where you will actually measure like how close they are to the people that you're trying to influence. Then that's trust, right? I'm much more likely to trust a friend that I know than a person who's 1 degree removed from my friend, right? So, okay, so that's how you find influence. So now that we have influence graph, right? Now the edge actually represents a high likelihood of influence. What metric do we compute, right? We can actually compute something called the eigenvector centrality. This is actually very similar to Google's PageRank, okay? So imagine what Google have to solve, right? Google basically have to solve that. What is the most authoritative web pages on the web, right? basically they use something called a page rank, right? So a web page is basically the internet is basically the World Wide Web is basically a bunch of web pages connected by hyperlinks between them, right? And they use PageRank to find out which web page is most authoritative. Now, if you stare at this problem long enough, you find that this is actually a very similar problem as finding the influencers, right? Instead of web pages, you have people, right? Instead of hyperlinks, you have interactions on social media, right? And so now we can actually compute something called eigenvector centrality, which is very similar to the PageRank. And my time is up, but I'm just trying to wrap up really quickly here. So this eigenvector centrality is actually very similar to PageRank in the sense that it's not only about how many people do you connect it to. If I mark like how many people do you connect it to, right? Who do you think is most influential here? You probably think it's these two guys, right? But if I show you the network underneath them, right, you would think very differently, right? Even though this guy had a lot of influence, a lot of friends, but all of his friends are losers that nobody cares about, right? So, right? Then they don't really matter, right? This guy actually has a much higher eigenvector centrality because his friends actually, have other friends that they could propagate. It has more potential to propagate, right? So now the ability to quantify something has nothing to do with whether or not it actually matters, right? This is what Einstein said. So now that we have a very good way to quantify people's influence, that doesn't mean it matters, right? So how do we actually find out if it actually matters to your business? Well, we could do statistics, right? But that only gives a correlation, and then we'll have to experiment with it to prove causation, and then finally we could build a mechanistic model. And we built such a model. So I'm just going to give you So this is actually published in Journal of Marketing Research. It's a very reputable publication. So I'm just going to give you the results here, so I'm out of time. So there's actually two mechanisms that combine to create word of mouth, value for word of mouth. One is basically acquisition of customers, and the second one is acceleration of adoption. Okay. Now the second takeaway is that influence does matter. Okay. If you compare the random seeding versus seeding with influencers, right? The increase is about 49%. Okay, and lastly, there's actually some case studies that validated that. And lastly, there's a huge first mover advantage, right? So if you're the only brand who's doing cultivating your influencer, engaging with the influencer, that's great because you will have 7.5 times the first mover advantage. All right. So with that, if you want to dig deeper, contact me. My information can be is always there, and you can scan this QR code. And I've written a couple books on this. So thank you very much.
I wonder, Michael, if you might start by talking about. It seems like this is something that could apply B2B, B2C, whatever. You're still. It's those 6 links in the chain.
That's right.
that you're working on. Are there dynamics that are more B2C specific versus B2B specific? Are there any of those elements that play a larger role? Yeah,
the timing actually plays a bigger role. Very different for B2B versus B2C. Right? B2C, the sales cycle is much shorter. Right? B2B, the sales cycle is much longer. So you have to consider a much bigger temporal window. That window's susceptibility to influence is much longer when you talk about B2B.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Very
Any
good.
more questions?
Michael, Ward Tongan from Medtronic. And you mentioned Clout earlier on. Could this ever possibly be a scoring system for a place like Clout or Cred? Is that your next business?
Well, I'm a data scientist, so business is not really kind of my cup of tea. I'll let someone run the business. But I think they have the potential to do that, but they're not doing that. I think partly it's because they don't have either statistical savviness or whatever. I don't know why they're not doing that. I publish this out there. Actually, some of their scientists talk to me, and I kind of give them all this information. They're not implementing it. And so Lithium, we are not at the business of computing people's influence. We actually help brands cultivate their influencer. So as a kind of byproduct, we have to measure people's influence, right? But we are not in the business of measuring influence.
Right, thanks. Well,
Yeah, there's a
John?
Okay.
John with Kohler. Your first and your last factors, domain credibility and confidence, you said they're different things.
Yes.
If the audience believes has confidence in you,
Yeah.
even if you're not credible. Help me understand that difference, because
Yeah, so confidence is an attribute of the influencer, right? So influence is a concept involving two parties, right? You have the influencer, you have the target audience, right? If there's only one influencer, he cannot actually influence anyone, right? The action had to be carried out by the audience, in order for his influence to be propagated, right? So confidence or trust is an attribute of the audience, right? Whether you guys trust me or not, right? That's an attribute of you guys, right? But whether I have credibility or not, that's my attribute, right? That's an attribute of me, right? So as influencer. So those are different in that way, right? So granted, they're related, right? If you don't have credibility, right, you may not, a lot of people won't trust them. They're correlated, right? But they're not the same thing, right? So I may trust my brother a lot, but he doesn't have the credibility on, say, electronics, then he's not going to influence me, right? Even though I trust him dearly, right? So.
Okay, Jessica.
Hi, Jessica from Visa. I have two quick questions.
Sure.
The first being, when message penetration is actually the end goal, so it's not anything about sales, do you feel like the timing window broadens because you're actually looking for a long-term change in the way people view a specific brand? And then my second question is about linking behavior. So do you feel like there's a third-party addition to this when someone is linking to credible sources? Do you feel like that adds to the credibility of who they are and how much you trust them?
Okay, so let's answer the first question first. So the first question is about if you're trying to drive awareness, right? So when you're trying to drive awareness, surprisingly, the timing is actually shorter because people forget. Right? When they're not considering it, right? I mean, how many times do you have to see something, to remember that you saw it? Not long. And typically, if you see it once, like if you don't see it again, the rest of your life, most likely you'll forget it like the next day or next few minutes or hour, right? It's out of your mind, right? If you are actually interested and actually want to make a purchase so the timing is right and all the other, right channel and all this stuff, then the time actually has longer effect. So the second question is linking behavior.
Yeah. If you are linking to trusted third-party sources, do you feel like that improves your credibility or your trustworthiness or any of these things that impact?
Sure, it does. It does, but it's ultimately, you should not do that just for the sake of linking, right? You should do that really as that provides value to the end customer, the end user, right? If you do that just for the sake of linking, then people will find out, right? People find out and then basically you will actually have maybe what appear to be credibility, but you lose trust, right? The other factor don't matter. So when you don't have all 6 factors, then you break the chain, right? So, yeah, there's a question there.
From Debbie?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Debbie Curtis-Mangley with Ariba. So a question I had is you're looking at influencers, are you able to reveal kind of the length of their influence, such as, I might have a friend who posts something and I might talk about what they've posted, but somebody else in my network might motivate me more to take those next action steps?
Yeah, so this is actually the study that I did that I didn't get to go into detail with the 3 professors that I work with, is that it's actually very difficult to quantify the value of influence because influence is so pervasive, right? If I heard about, say, the Apple new iPhone 5 from Keith here, right? But then, I made a purchase because somebody else, just showed me some of these cool apps, and then so who's influenced me, right? It's not that Keith doesn't have influence, right? He's influenced a little bit, and other people. So the method that we use is called total impact upon removal. Okay, so the value of his influence is quantified the value lost if you remove him from the network. Okay, if you basically, if I want to quantify Keith's influence, right, in his Kurt, sorry,
It's okay.
Sorry.
I want to make sure you have
Yeah.
influence too.
Yeah, that's right. So Kurt's influence on his social network, right? Basically, if I would remove him from his social network and see what's the value lost to the brand, right? So if he's a great influencer, that loss of value will be huge, right? So that's how we quantify that. That's how we'll be able to come up with those numbers at the end. There.
Great. I think we could get a bunch more questions in, but we are short on time. So everybody, how about a round of applause for Michael Wu?
Yeah, and I'll be at the barbecue. So.
There you go.
The video you just saw was a presentation from socialmedia.org's Brands Only Summit. from Orlando at Disney's Grand Floridian Resort from December 9th through 11th, 2013. This thrilling event featured 16 peer-to-peer collaborative workshops, 12 how-to classes, 12 real-world case studies, 3 brilliant authors, and 2 amazing keynotes. The socialmedia.org Brands Only Summit is where you'll learn the latest in enterprise social media management, make connections with social media leaders like you, and engage in deep peer-to-peer discussions. See more videos and find out how to join us at our next event at socialmedia.org/events. Socialmedia.org is the community for social media leaders at the world's greatest brands. Members help one another by sharing best practices, actionable advice, and solutions to issues they can't talk about anywhere else, all in our vendor-free environment. If you're leading social media at a major brand, you belong in our family. Learn more at socialmedia.org.